All right, so I'm really glad you guys are here today. I've been brewing over this idea called negative pragmatism, and to me, it isn't very clear what it is exactly, because we have to go into a lot of how we're understanding lack, the forms of lack. I think the problem that we run into with lack is that lack is always kind of lacking, and I think that's the kind of tautological position that we end up finding ourselves in. But I would really like to expand the conversation about this. And so my starting point for negative pragmatism is the negative point is lack itself. And then the pragmatic position is what are we doing with our lack and what can we do with our lack? And so I have basically invited all of you guys here today because I think you guys all have very interesting and compelling ideas about lack and what is missing. So I've kind of paired topics with everybody, but doesn't mean you have to talk about it. But I think we could circle around these topics, but they're not like a strict, like have to talk about them. We can just follow wherever it goes. Fundamentally, I don't even think we'll even get to the real deep stuff anyways, because there'll be so much to talk about. The other question that I have open is, do we want to open this wormhole of virtual, potential, actual, and lack? Which we went into the net session the last time, which was very, it got very intense. Once we opened the conversation about the virtual and where to situate lack between that. So yeah, just kind of give a brief. I invited Luber because I know he has working on themes with theme and lack and story. Thomas Jockin, you have the ideas about Aristotle and lack and like, should we even bring some of these? What are the restraints? What are the critiques that are coming in from Aristotle that we might miss? Stanley, you and I have caught, plenty of conversations about uselessness, wastefulness. And I'd also like to bring religion to this because I thought it was interesting as is religion a sort of negative pragmatism in itself? Is it because it's uselessness that it survives? In a way. And then Sam, really would love to hear you talk about or your conceptions on lack, architectural space, physical spaces, whatever kind of space you want to play with. But again, none of you guys are tied to these topics. Okay. If you guys have other things that you've been working on or speculating, please bring it to the table. So other than that, just to kind of keep it kind of ordered, if you just want to raise your hand or just jump in, you guys are welcome. But that's the point of my speech today.
I can start off the bat. I mean, I had thought about this a little bit in relation to architecture, and immediately what I thought of as like as a concern defined by lack within the architectural discipline, and maybe this is able to extend itself out into sculpture as well, is like shadow is a really excellent metaphor for lack. It's just the lack of light, like really, and we think of shadow as, so often we think of shadow in the positive, right? Like there's a shadow on the ground, that's an object that we identify, but really it's the lack of the field of light that we see within, right? And shadow is a really important aspect of form, and it's an important thing to consider in architecture. I mean, like, not only do you just want a building that's sensitive to its environment, but the thing with shadow is that it betrays space, it betrays depth. So when you look, like, I think what's really unappealing about some like simple modern structures is that there is no depth to a facade. It's just flat and it has no shadows. There's nothing happening. It's just wall, flat, often glass. Glass is interesting because it's transparent, and so you do get a bit of sense of depth, but for the most part, like, we want that spatial intricacy that comes with depth and with articulated spaces, which entail shadow. And I think like our wanting to see shadows cast across these across the spaces, like the structures of our public places, it's funny because it's like that's the other metaphor for lack is desire, right? Like lack is the it's the affective lack that, you know, it's the thing which isn't there, which you notice isn't there, is sort of like a desire.
That's a great opening. Yeah, you know, this is actually interesting because this also goes straight into Thomas Jockin's idea of partial objects. And I almost think your formulation, Sam, about the fact that there's shadows reveals that actually there is partial objects. Like it's funny that we would perceive the shadow as not being a part of the object itself, which has made me think about this, and even how when you put it in the context of sculpture and form, we need that shadow to have the form in some sense. And then there's this other notion of how you could say desire is sort of the shadow of our appetites, which is very interesting. Yeah, I like this. So I will. Looks like it's I think it was Stanley. Matt, you raised first, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for bringing in shadow, Sam. I think there's a lot to play with there. It makes me think of an essay that was pretty influential for me when I read it, called "In Praise of Shadows" by Junichiro Tanizaki. And he kind of theorizes that the Japanese aesthetic came from the fact that his ancestors lived in buildings with very long eaves that cast long shadows. And he says that they learned to direct shadows towards beauty's end. And what I like that he points out is that actually what's going on in a Japanese room specifically he's describing is it's not actually playing between light and darkness, but it's actually a play between different shades of shadow. So there's different shades of lack as well. So it's not just wholeness, fullness and presence versus lack, but actually the Japanese aesthetic, he's trying to argue, is playing with different levels of lack that create these contrasts too, which is a really fascinating concept, that there's not just lack and wholeness, but there's different variations of lack that can contrast with each other and create their own sort of depth.
I love this, because I think that's why this is why I had to bring you guys here today, because I was like, the lack is lacking, and I feel like we're getting at that point of revealing how much it lacks, that there is different shades as such. But with that, I'll pass it to Jockin.
Yeah. I mean, also, by the way, partial objects, that's more of a Daniel invention. I just happened to be on the call with him when working with him on that concept. But I would say I want to give credit. It's a Daniel Garner concept, more than me per se. But I very much appreciate it. I love what Sam said and also what Matthew said. Here, actually, the fun part of this context, immediately what came to mind was, by the way, the reason why historically in philosophy this discussion of lack has been dismissed. The argument has been, you see, in Aquinas and specifically with eclipses. Actually, an eclipse is a very common example used, is to say the explanation of an eclipse is dependent on the sun and the earth, for example, and the moon. It's not the eclipse that exists, it's the other objects that exist. And thus there's a kind of dismissal, kind of hand wave to say, well, no, the actual thing to discuss and to get a definition to eclipse is all the other things. The eclipse itself doesn't exist. I want to be fair that the reason why that's been the position generally is because, and I'll share my screen to make my case. I don't know if you guys have ever seen those examples of artists using basically shadow to make figures and shapes. So when Sam made an example for architecture, you guys see my screen? I'm not getting confirmation.
That's an amazing photo.
Yes.
Yeah, I see your.
That's exactly the point. So the problem, the fear and the anxiety about lack, right? Because this is basically like that figure of shadow is a real figure, and it is making a profile. but it's not making explicitly a one-to-one relationship, because you can use these accidental arrangements of just letters, right? In this case, and there's other examples too. This is an issue of almost the doctrine of images, or like the issue of images to reality. An image can be misrepresented, and lacks kind of operate as an image almost. And this is the danger about them, is that if you sit here and think that, for example, this is a profile of a man, in reality, the object that is making it is something completely else. It's completely other than what that sign is showing you. Another example, something else. Oh, is it? Yeah, another example. All right, this is a pile of garbage, but it's been arranged in a certain way so that its relationship with the light source is creating a figure, right? Creating these figures of people, in this case. So I just want to, this is effectively the danger of what Lack is discussing or talks about. I think that's an important kind of like, even though I'm such a huge advocate of it, I think there's a lot of power behind it. The reason why it's been historically dismissed is because it's the fear and anxiety of being led astray. And in this group, like with Javier, we've had discussions, like last summer, I think we had her over the fall, I forgot. But basically, like, this is the issue of when we are led by images and we think that's reality when it's not. And the sign, the time we see that is when there's failure. Basically, the image, like in a psychological perspective, when one has an image in their mind of someone they're obsessed about or have a delusion about, right? And then you actually end up in failure because your image in your head of this person is not the reality of it. And there you go. So this is like why this is a huge anxiety, I think, when we talk about this or when we draw this out. But I want to point out the other side of it. I think is quite important is, yet images sometimes do work. See, this is why it's not. This is why even with me addressing this point of the danger about it, it's not good enough just to dismiss it as just to say, don't trust images or don't trust Lack. Like it has no standing in reality. That's not true, because sometimes the images are true. Whoops. Because the reason why is if that wasn't the case, we couldn't use language, mathematics. All these are images. These are all representations of reality in different modes and ways. And yet we can use them to come to accurate conclusions, and accurate action particularly. So that's why it's not good enough from a design perspective to talk about that. So I want to put that out here. It's like terms of like, I think my understanding of why we're together here to talk about it is to say, what are the consequences of a doctrine of Lack and how do we live our lives according to it? Because that's basically for me what it comes down to, is that from this, what do we do with it? What do we do with these hands? It's kind of the way to put this. But we need to point that out. Kind of one of the ways to draw this out, I'm thinking about it, is, and I think I love what Sam brought up about kind of architecture and how we live in spaces, is the interfacing of like physical interfacing of reality, like physical extensional reality with psychological states. Lack is this really interesting interpenetration of these two supposedly separate domains. They interrace with each other. And partly even from an art training background. So with Sam comes from architecture, I come from painting and graphic design. The reason why also we talk about negative space. So besides shadow play as a kind of as a sign of a figure, kind of interfacing with light. When we work in compositions, generally the negative space of an object is completely dependent on the frame. So a frame is a choice, either imposed by the designer or given to them to work with. So it's a framing, right, that informs what is negative space. And actually that actually gives you the answer if your composition is effective or not. There is no composition without a frame. The same objects inside a composition can go from failure to success in terms of aesthetic composition, like over stability in the space, which is also, that's interesting language, because that's the language we use in critiques in art. Is the composition stable? Is it dynamic or is it undynamic? Is it flat? Is it resolved or unresolved? Like these the only way this has any comprehension to us is by a frame. And I've used this other example with Javier about typography, right? It's the spaces between the words that actually tell you that's a word. If there were no spaces there, it's completely incoherent. It's just a big block, just a gigantic square of black. It doesn't have any meaning. So these are all like, that's why it's important. Like, one aspect of it is the danger of just a doctrine of images, and lack is one mode of it that's traditionally been historically dismissed. So how do we address that? But the other part is it actually seems like any capacity of understanding is dependent on these kind of properties, which or tend to be partial objects, objective, subjective. You can use that language. I would almost say like interpenetrative of subjects and objects. You want to put it that way. I'll just close on the last note. Something I've been really thinking about a lot is what Matthew brought up, and there is the idea of a hierarchy of relationships, right? That some objects have more existence than others, right? That's a chain of being argument. That's an old school medieval argumentation right there. We would generally not accept that in modern science or modern ontology. But this discussion of lack, and actually the examples I just showed you, because there are examples where no, the shadow actually is the figure. Like, and you actually can use the shadow to know the thing you're referencing. In other examples, so but there's a case where there is a one-to-one relationship of the shadow to the figure. But then there's other examples I just showed you where it's completely accidental. So that is an example of a gradation of existence, that image shadow has a different level of intensity of reality. I think that's fascinating. Because you got to give us, if you say that is not true, they're co-equally as real, you have to give me a reason why that's the case. I don't think you can, but I'll leave it at that.
Well, I wanted to hop in. I appreciated that you pointing out like the connection historically between shadows and the idea of deception and being deceived. Obviously thinking of like Plato's cave and that, really starting there for sure. But I was kind of going to move in the direction you started to kind of poo-poo at the end there. I was like, well, don't the examples that you're pushing forward kind of call into question whether the accidental arrangement is really the truth of the matter? Like, because, scientifically we might say like, oh, the truth of the piece is the random hanging objects. But like, it seems to me like we're trying to argue, like we're trying to determine I would like to argue at least that the shadow is the truth of the piece, and that it's not that the shadow is actually not less real than the dangly pieces. So I do find myself torn. I kind of brought up the idea of kind of gradations of lack. I'm not really like a China bean kind of guy, but also I do think that so I like the move of actually the subjective effect and the accidental structure are kind of on the same ontological plane. So yeah, I guess I'm of two minds.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think is it Luber or is it no Sun? I think you have some.
Yeah, just to continue on with that, actually, Matthew. I was so Thomas. What you reminded me of was Austin's theory of performativity, or like performative speech acts. This kind of like dawning realization in linguistics that like, oh, like words do things. Words do a lot of really pragmatic things in the world. And I think that's a shadow. Like if we're using this sort of metaphor of shadow for lack, and a word is sort of a shadow of an object. It's not the thing itself, but it's indexical. It points towards a thing, and it does so in a deceptive manner, like Thomas was talking about. Otherwise we wouldn't have misunderstandings. Like there's polysemy, there's metaphor, there's even sarcasm, humor that like gets in the way of like language being purely designative. But anyways, like there is when we're asking ourselves, okay, what is some of the things that we do with lack, and what can we take away from this to act out in the world? It's like, yeah, like marriage itself is, it's a complete change of status between two individuals. It creates family. Like it has so many like real material changes in the world, and it's completed by two people saying I do, you know? And like, I mean, that's not even a noun. So like, you know, what is that a shadow of? It's really interesting, but it's I think just carrying on with what Matthew said, it's like in that instance, those words are sort of more real maybe than like the ring, or I don't know. They're the thing which gather to them, like the vows are the thing which gather to them the substance of the marriage or something.
Well, I think it's interesting to see how that I do takes on polysemic qualities in the material world. And that this is like, I think what you were saying, talking about the doctrine of lack, I think there's a lot of what's going on here is an attempt to civilize civilization with these ideas of like getting together in this way is better for X, Y, and Z, depending on like which time in history you are. Like to quell sexual rivalry, we will create certain types of pair bonds. And that I do in a certain context would be like, I do agree to obey my husband or something like this. Like there'll be an expansion upon it. Like what are we agreeing to? And there, you know, are very few things nowadays that are like lifelong commitments. Like that does bring in a certain type of negativity that's like you can't just bounce. I mean, you can. You can do what you want, but the idea is like we are going to create an architecture wherein we will reside until death. And I think a lot of that, I like where it was going with architecture and thinking about like Virilio and even just changing this idea of like orientating a home or a public space from being like in front of or behind walls, doors, etc., to like above and below, and how that might change our relation to lack. What it, you know, is it an accident that the cathedrals of Europe have these vaulted ceilings? Why are those ceilings so high? Why didn't they make them 10 feet high? And that's space, you know, that's like space for the human to kind of like be in awe and allow the soul to grow. Polysemic qualities is just like, I think it just means like how many different associations like you can have with a word. So like words are sort of endless in that sense, and it's like really difficult to, once you start talking, it's as if you admit your souls have a certain amount of distance that you have to use speech to feel like you're getting closer, and then you kind of go like on a bunch of detours because someone is like, well, I thought nice means this, and you're like, no, nice clearly means this. And so how, I also wonder if we can, I don't know if you talked about this before I got on, but just with the gradations of lack, are you talking about something like a difference between like a material lack and an ontological lack? Like if someone is like, I'm just so hungry because I can't afford food, versus someone being like, I'm looking for meaning or purpose or something like that, like a different quality, or like the gradations are one vertical that have different, you know, kind of like 1 to 10. I'm tired or something like that.
It's open to whoever wants to answer this question, by the way.
I mean, I was the one who made the comment, so I can jump in. I mean, the original example I used was the idea of, for example, let's say you have like a sphere, like you have a sphere, like an actual physical sphere, and a shadow gets put on it. Let's say under a hypothetical, you're not aware of the sphere actually, you're looking only at the shadow. The shadow of a sphere and the sphere have a very close correspondence with each other. So even though the shadow is it's a flattening of space, a three-dimensional object has been now projected onto a two-dimensional space, so there's been a dimension reduction. There is a very good correspondence. So if you just saw the shadow of a sphere, you would know. You can use, there's a truth value, right? You can use just the virtual flattening, the lower dimension virtual image to make an inference of the thing that's actually there, right? So that's an example of that's the effect cause relationship of analogy that is said to be very truthful and has a lot, we can rely on that. Arguments of theology are based on that. So the point is, if you have, especially if you use a doctrine of virtue and you say virtues exist, and even though everyone's lacking in perfection, but the fact that we know that there's a degree of perfection, things are better than worse, that must mean there is, they use the example, virtue, and the degrees of virtue is the shadows of a lower dimensionality. The higher dimensionality is God, who is the full perfection of virtue in its totality. So even if we never saw virtue in its totality, nor can you, because it's not material in the first place, because it's not actuality. We can use as we can make a very safe inference. What the anxiety though is, that's what I'm getting at, was my examples I showed, where that shadow, that two-dimensional flattening of a three-dimensional space was deceptive. If you just use the lower dimensional representation image to make to inference out what it was, you'd be wrong. That's an example. That's one way to talk about it. You did make an example of a cultural social normative aspect of it. Like, no, I don't think anyone here would deny that's an element here. That's a frame. Like that's the framing, because it's totally true. Like, to use marriage, I mean, let's be blunt. Marriage at one point was a bodily contract. What it was. The added meaning of it, of other dimensions about it, is a different framing, a different account. Well, that's no different, quite frankly, to use a geometry example. Now, Aristotle talks about this. That's no different than, quite frankly, a circle. A carpenter uses a circle, so does a mathematician, a geometer. But their degree, intensity of knowledge about it is completely different. Their relationship is very different to it. Doesn't take away the carpenter's understanding of a circle, nor from the geometer. They just have different degrees. So that's another example of it. So this is an example when we talk about these gradations of, one's a degree of knowledge, another one's degree of basically inferencing existence from a sign by a lower dimensionality flattening, which by Javier, the virtual discussion, and that'd be an example. I mean, in my mind, that's an example of it. But that's such a huge wild mess, I'm going to put that to the side.
I think Luber.
So I think going into this, I basically prepared like a lecture. And I guess I just got conflated what the symposium really is. I just figured everyone was gonna go in and just here's your lecture, here's your lecture, here's your lecture. So if I talk for a bit too long, just jump in and tell me to shut up. But with regard, before I get into what I had prepared, with regard to the shadow that Sam's bringing up, I think it's a good thing to think about when you do see the shadow. At what point in the lax unfolding is that occurring? To me, when you see a shadow, it's the completion of a situation. It's the completion of an experience already. So it's the moment of realizing a shadow is the moment you realize you are experiencing something, you are corresponding with something in the world, in other words. So when you see at least the way I think of it, it's like when you see a tree shadow, it's because the tree is there. It's not like in the process of becoming a tree that you see the shadow. The becoming part, there is no shadow that you can see necessarily in becoming a tree. The second it sprouts up and it's already growing as a tree and it creates a shadow, you would be calling it a tree at that point. But in the actual becoming of a tree, you're not going to necessarily see the negative space because it's in a different dimension temporally, I would say. I would say lack is still present in this dimension, but it's different. It presents itself in a different way. And this is where the virtual to me comes in. I mean, when at the net, when we're talking about a virtual, the epitome for me of the virtual is like when you're telling a story and you're throwing ideas and you're throwing different notions on the board. Like you are completely in a virtual space. There's nothing tangible happening right now. You are everything in a certain sense is material. Everything is malleable and changeable, and you are playing with pure ideas in a certain sense. Maybe pure is not the best word, but I think you get the sentiment. Um, but yeah, I think the virtual lays the ground for the actual in a certain sense. It's not that you can have the virtual without the actual. I think if you see a virtual plane, at that point you're already in the becoming. The actual is already becoming. Like the second the virtual is already uh, beat it out, if you will. Like in a story, you beat out your story. Then, in that sense, the story is starting to present itself. Like the actual story at that point emerges and it presents itself. Whether you actually like write it or not, or shoot the short, or shoot the film, or whatever, I think that's a different state of actuality. But for me, I think the virtual, when you truly see the vision of your virtual, the actual emerges at that point. So I think the virtual needs the actual, like for it to actually be a virtual to play in the virtual dimension is to like actually go through it and actually like figure out whatever you need to figure out in that virtual dimension in order to even like tap into whatever, you know, tangible actual thing that you're doing at that point. I think it's like ipso facto. You need one to have the other. I don't think you can just play in the virtual and it has no bearings on anything actual. If that is the case, then you're not actually like going through the virtual plane, so to speak. You're like almost toying with it, which I'm just thinking out loud when it comes to that. So feel free to push back on those points. But so with regard to what I had prepared today, which has everything to do with what we were talking about with Shadow, I titled it "Lack Theme and the Possessed Narrator," and basically I just wanted to start with this notion of what a theme is. And I think before I just tell you what a theme is ultimately, I think it's safe to say that we see our theme through the lack. Realizing our lack is when we see our theme. So what a theme is simply it's a command. It's a command that allows you to realize a lack insofar as that lack that you're realizing morphs into a different lack. It's not just a static, not in the Ebert sense static, but static in the sense that there's only a myopic lack. There's this one lack and it's not connected to any other lacks. It's a theme actually opens up your mind in seeing a lack, and it opens it in in a way where you're able to see other lacks where it can go to, where your mind can focus onto. So for a story, I just see lack as there's two ways lack enters a story in my mind. Lack enters a story through revelation and through disclosure of the theme, essentially. So the difference between disclosure and revelation is simply, so like in a story, lack is essentially being in an ironic state. You are lacking something, and because you are aware that you're lacking something, you do something to try to overcome that lack. Or there's so many different ways you can express irony, but basically it's just a vicious cycle of you doing something in order to overcome something, and it actually never allows you to overcome it. Whatever you're doing to overcome it just actually pushes you away from that. So there's two ways that there's two ways that this happens. When the ironic situation is being disclosed, you are basically aware of how you're living in the ironic feedback loop. And the disclosure is basically the irony that you are already aware of is just disclosing to you, and you're making a choice already under the guise of the ironic situation that you're in. Where the revelation aspect is you are operating in a certain lack that you're unaware of. You're operating in a certain irony that you're completely unaware of. And the revelation is you become aware of it, not that you were already aware of it. There isn't something being disclosed to you. There's an ignorance that you're operating under initially, and it eventually morphs into you being aware of it, and then a choice emerges, a choice of you basically choosing to either move from one lack to the other. And what that means is you realize the lack that you're in, and you make a choice based off of you newly realizing it versus you making a choice already possessed under the ironic situation that you can't see beyond it. There is no sense of revelation. The you sorry, I'm just trying to collect my thoughts. Basically, when in a story a narrator is actually telling a story, it's always in the form of a revelation and never in the form of disclosure. So what that means is you're not looking for the lack. So I think a lot of the problem that I was hearing in the net was we're already aware of the irony that we're living in, and we're looking for lack in a situation where we already know we're lacking. We're aware that we're lacking in a certain sense, and we're looking for a way out when we're already aware of it. So in a story, in the beginning, you're never aware of it. That's why you get incited upon. And then in getting incited upon, you start getting a sense of the lack in which you were occupied by virtue of a new lack that starts to slowly presents itself to you in the story. So you're in a constant tension of a certain type of ignorance in a way where you're not actually acknowledging one lack or the other, like especially in the second act of the story in the journey. You're not committing to basically one side or the other of the command. I'll elaborate a little bit on the command, but it's just to go off what I had planned in my mind. How do we get ourselves in a position where we aren't so explicit about lack? That's the way of being pragmatic about it, because we actually let lack be in a certain sense. And in that sense, it just lets us be thrown into a position where we keep realizing the lack. And then once we realize the lack, there's like a certain forgetting of the lack that we were once in, because there's a new lack that is emerging that's forcing us to forget. So it's like we're remembering and forgetting at the same time. And that's because we let that happen instead of being so hyper focused on the lack. And I'm not saying it's easy to do. I think for me, it's like impossible. Like once you become aware of the concept, it's like almost like it eats at you in a certain way. Like not in like a bad way, but it just, you become so aware of it that it's like it feels like it's hard to escape it in a certain sense. And then that's when like the whole issue of negative pragmatics, like I think it's a beautiful project, but I think it's just a byproduct of being ironic ultimately, that we're all in a certain sense, like the philosopher might be the most ironic individual in a certain sense. That's why, like Javier said, like the philosopher's in like an impossible position. But yeah, basically, I like to just challenge everyone to think about lack. I have a lot more to say, but I feel like I've been talking too much. I just want to, I guess, challenge people to see lack not as a momentary thing. Like, oh, I see the shadow. I see something in this particular moment, and try to see lack in a more ecstatic way, in a more, it's unfolding in a way that has to do with a lack that I'm not explicitly aware of yet. And in that sense, it kind of challenges you to like kind of forget about the lack that you're in a way. I hope I made sense. I kind of jumped around, so forgive me. But yeah, I'll pass it off and put my hand up later.
You know, Andrew, this kind of reminds me of what I kind of came up with, the concept of like pure hope. Is it possible that we can manufacture what I would call like a pure hope? And my idea of a pure hope is actually a very negative concept, meaning that the danger with hopes is precisely the content. And I'm going to use the content in the way that Thomas Jockin revealed the picture of the blocks resembling a face. For me, the pure hope is the face and not the content of the blocks making the face. So that's the kind of thing of pure hope that I'm talking about. But ironically, I think, Andrew, is that in order for pure hope to exist, you need to sort of be aware that it's the content itself that is not the pure hope, right? And it's interesting because if you add content to hope, you reach failure, right? You get disillusioned. You realize that whatever you hoped for was not the thing that you hoped it would be, or whatever. You can call these expectations, so on, goals, plans, whatever. But the pure hope persists because there's always content that we're providing to this hope, which is interesting because in our current framing of hope, it's hope only exists, or hope is only as real as such when the content is real. But I'm actually approaching from the opposite end, saying that a pure hope is precisely real because you cannot help but give content to that hope. You have to fill in the space. It's to me, I cannot imagine functioning off of what I would call in reality a pure hope. I would only have an ironic position of I'm aware that I lack when I say that I hope about something. But I know enough that when I hope for something, it most likely is not what I think it is or what I imagine it to be. But I have to provide a content to it. I have to imagine something. I have to fill in the gaps of what that hope would be like. And this is where I find hope and pragmatism very interesting, because I think pragmatism is always working with the content as a positive in itself. Whereas I want to work with the shadows of the content, and we function off that as a kind of primary emphasis. Because I think the difference between a pragmatic, the way that we talk about pragmatism as such, and a negative pragmatism is precisely a sort of particular emphasis. I don't even think when I talk about negative pragmatism, you guys have all proved this in various ways, that it's not a concept that doesn't exist. I think it actually has always existed. I'm just giving it a name to it now. In hopes of what Luber you're talking about, in hopes of finding ourselves precisely in this ironic position where we are aware of the lack, but also we're not trying to escape it. But we understand that the very capture of lack is what allows us to have the possibilities of deciding what to do, of giving various forms to things. But yeah, I see that Matthew.
I'm grateful,
sorry,
Javier, that you brought up the idea of hope, because actually I just shared out to I shared this in my email newsletter on Friday, but I gave a presentation last weekend at some workshops in Princeton on lamentation, and I tried to argue that lamentation is actually the flip side of hope. So lamentation is actually this infinite negativity, and actually we could read hope as well as an infinite negativity. So I kind of take Job's, Zizek's read of the book of Job, where Job basically insists on refusing the satisfaction of meaning. And so I think that lamentation is this interesting act where we insist, we refuse to accept any consolation for a loss. It's basically what a lamentation is. But that's actually, interestingly enough, when you insist on that negativity long enough, you create a positivity called hope, which is actually this demand. And just to keep the conversation moving forward to your point, what came out in the ensuing conversation after my presentation was that, so people were like, okay, but then what do you do next? And what I realized is that there's an interesting paradox where reconciliation, basically the solution to lamentation and hope, is both impossible and necessary. There has to be a reconciliation, and that reconciliation is strictly speaking impossible because the object cannot be returned, the loss cannot be filled in and remediated, and yet somehow reconciliation is done. So the impossible can be real somehow, and so that was kind of that's something I want to keep exploring.
And I think I forgot who is next. Was it Jokin or Sun?
Do you mind if I just jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
Real quick.
Go ahead.
My roommate's saying my dog is acting weird, so I'm gonna have to like bounce just for a little bit. Hopefully, I can come back and he's fine. When you notice lack, when you realize lack, you're immediately thrown into an active state. It's so the focus of negativity might seem like you're stuck in some like negative space, but it's not actually that at all. It's you're actually starting to enter into a story, and like a story has to come into itself. Like you don't know that you're about to embark in some journey, but when you realize lack, you are forced to make a choice that reflects every choice that you will make thereafter and how you understand your choice before. Like it reshapes your entire identity. And I think what you said, Matthew, just really made me think about the lack of people thinking about how you're so active in realizing lack, that it's something that creates life and not something that destroys the life that you're living. I think there's a conflation where when you hear, oh, I'm lacking something, it's like I'm ruined, I'm done, I don't have this. But it's literally the opposite. It's like Joachim was saying, like you need the space for the words to exist, for the sentence to happen. So like for a theme, like the theme commands you to enter into a ironic situation only to come out of the ironic situation into a new one. It's like it's I'm reading Levinas's work right now, Totality and Infinity, and he has a section on discourse, and he's talking a lot about theme and how basically uh, the key to being ethical for him, it seems like, is there's a great quote here. There's a certain possession. You're possessed. You're basically possessed by the exteriority of the other. So like when you rub up against a lack, you are facing something infinite. You're facing something. Your mind. It's like it could spiral, and in that sense, the theme is actually what binds you to. Shit, my roommate's calling me. But basically, I think thinking about lack and how it morphs into another lack is basically thinking negativity. Like the movement of lack to lack is thinking negativity, and I think that was a great point. Sorry, but I'm gonna have to bounce. I can't even think straight with this dog.
All right.
Well, it's a decent, a decent segue because like it might be something that makes sort of like a mark of maturation possible. Like, why don't we expect babies to be able to deal with lack? Why don't we expect a wild or domesticated animal to be able to deal with lack? And ostensibly, it's their need and their desire are together while we have this split between need and desire. And I wonder what the relationship with the sort of social norms and the frames can do to help widen or bring that gap closer together. So I'm wondering even what he was saying with these like commands to realize a lack. Like, are these coming from self images? Like, is psyche pursuing some kind of ideal? Does psyche need information to like go for and then fail necessarily? But in the attempt, they're like, I've changed, I'm transformed. And then the idea is like, what we're sort of sold in our culture is this moment of the big rest. So some Christian metaphysics will say it'll come after the physical body dies. We leave the material plane. Other people will say it's once you get enough money, then you'll be able to be like, cool. So I love this like pure hope as an extreme denial of the big rest. It feels very much like an affirmation of life, of like, you know, almost like a response to like a Wilberian boomeritis that's like, no, I will not become ossified in my being. I will continue to engage in the process of life. And then I wonder about like the emergence of self-images and like whether or not we're able to be honest with ourselves of like who we use, just because I feel like the amount I don't have this fully fleshed out, but I just feel like the amount of exogenous image saturation is like so much more than it's ever been. Like not 10x, like factors of 100 or 1,000. And for the longest time, a lot of people, kind of in the religious circles would say, like, don't make an image out of like a process. Don't make it like an image out of God. And I wonder, how we cycle through all those, and kind of say, like, I'd prefer not to, while remaining, a potential belonger of a community, so that we're not so foreign to everyone around us. They're just like, bro, what? So it seems very dance-like. That's the feeling I'm getting.
Thanks. Jochen, you have ideas?
I mean, it's a shame Luber jumped out because I had questions. I wanted to ask him about what he said, but I think what was just brought up, I think it actually points out a very serious issue. So an example for a material object, right? The sphere making a shadow versus our piece accidentally making the figure shadow. The problem is related to self-images. That's the problem. We don't even interface with that directly. We build mental models in our heads of the stimulus reality on the outside, which would be a shadow. That's kind of what I'm getting. Like, so it's like at least 2 levels of abstraction of images, basically, you're dealing with there, right from the get-go. So it could actually send into terror, because then you realize, oh, wait a minute, even the interfacing, the sensations I'm getting from stimulus from the outside world, they may be the metaphorical shadow of the sphere, for example. But then even my interpretation of that shadow, which is what Luber brought up a little bit, right? This other point was just me was talking about. There's no guarantee that that mental model was accurate, because it might be influenced by completely secondary things, cultural norms, social needs, pressures. Take your pick. I think that articulates even stronger the danger in all this of, like, we need to come to an answer to address this, because if you treat it as transparent, this is kind of like why I'm empathetic to Luber's point, but he's right in the end. But the thing is, the problem I have with if you just ignore it, like, as if the most dangerous thing people have is they think they have a transparent understanding of reality. That's the problem, is that everyone thinks the images are the reality, when in our just a simple toy example, you may think that's a profile face. Guess what? It's a bunch of letters. It's a bunch of blocks, for all you know. That's just one example. I mean, as I just talked about this mental model problem of the external stimulus, which may be a virtual flattening of a more complex dimensionality, we get even more complicated. But that's like a side thing. What I do want to point out, like, what was a pragmatic point, is like, what do we do with this? I kind of want to circle back to that point. We can talk about kind of I'm here talking about like the dangers. We're talking about these different aspects of it. I think personal judgment, because if we already accept that, there's definitely a temporal aspect to lack. Like, which I think is a fair Luber point. Like, and Luber was right about that point. There's that. I mean, we've talked before. Like, the example is when we say not yet. When we use that language of not yet, we are instantly positing some mode of lack right there. And it definitely has a temporal nature to it. I think it's our relationship with time. I think fundamentally, my personal, like, what's an ethics point? Like, how are we going to organize our lives around these questions? I think it's the nature of relationship with time. I think really that's what it comes down to. Like, what I mean by that is, I mean, I'm thinking about my life, and I'm thinking about my people, my friends in my life, and just kind of just the personal experiences of living. How many people actually plan their lives, like think through their lives, and that's what, as Luber said, you cannot do this in a really like explicit manner of, I'm going to be here in 10 years. Because that's never going to work, because you don't know how reality is going to play out. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But to have a kind of orientation with time that it's got actually maybe it's actually a relationship of time and love. Like it's kind of orienting your life around what you love, like what you find dedication and devotion to, and no matter how that gets played out in the particular reality of time as it moves forward, there's a kind of permanence or a kind of almost, yeah, as the kind of the Job example, I think was great by Matthew. The idea of a kind of, he refused to accept the easy answer, the easy explanation, to give an account of what he was experiencing. He denied it. He never denied God, but he denied that. He said, absolutely not. I refuse to be captured by some explanation of your small little mind. I think that's in terms of like way I'm thinking of hobby or talk about this kind of negative hope. It's a kind of relationship to a principle that you may not know how it gets articulated. I'm thinking of things like probability distributions. Like that's another thing too. I think as a figure of probabilities and likelihoods, because it's true. You may not know any particular instance where it's going to be in the probability, but you know it's going to be somewhere, even as an outlier. It is going to happen. You have certainty of that. You just don't know the particular individual event where it lines up. These are like orientation. So it's almost a relationship to time and a relationship to exposure. So it's exposure to upside. That's kind of like the ethical stance. Basically, how can you basically structure oneself to have better exposures to upsides, and then also prevention of downside in terms of payouts. That's a very pragmatic, mechanical way of approaching it. But but the thing is, what is determining those payouts and costs or harms? Is probably some doctrine of love, of devotion of some kind, most likely. Like it means because that's the only thing I could think of that, because I kind of think of Plato's discussions of love, for Symposium. It's an intermediate state. You're not in pure ignorance. You're not in complete ignorance, nor are you in knowledge, nor are you ugly, nor are you beautiful. You're in this intermediate state. So love has this very operative nature to knowledge, to like these intermediate states. In fact, that's the whole point. Philosophy's friend of philosophy. Right? It's kind of like love of wisdom. So I just kind of meditating and chewing on that, because that's the point. It's like there is no content. There is a content, but certainly not directly. Absolutely not in the particular individual moment. There's only a relationship of orientation, of almost awaiting, right? But with willingness to act at the right moments. Like that's kind of thing too. It requires a very different structure of relationship that a typical kind of like hustle culture attitude, you're going to hit this number and get like this quantum of some explicit image in the head. That's not good enough, because that just causes anxiety. That just causes basically all the symptoms that come up from that. So that's definitely not, I know you're not saying that, Javier, nor am I suggesting that, because that won't work. It has to be a different kind of relationship, and it probably requires some absolute relationship orientation to time and some relationship to love, most likely. I'm thinking through that. Last note, and I think also that thing too, is like, is time your enemy or your friend? I think it's very important. I think a lot of people treat time as an enemy, right? Because think about this. I mean, even the example of what is substance? We actually don't know what it is. We don't, because the best example we have is that which subsists, which persists over time. That is its only real Aristotle. Like everybody's basically concluding that's basically the best we got. So that's already kind of like fucked up. But there's a kind of biased assumption that's the point. Time is a time with sharp fangs, devours objects. So it's a presumption that things already are in full existence, and then time decays and eats at them, and breaks them down. Right? Even the model of entropy is based on that argument, that we're moving towards a state of disintegration. We have these presuppositions built in. So I think it's definitely this nature of time. I'm going to stop talking because I've been talking a lot. Because I also say the last note, I agree with that Job model of don't give me an explanation with your small little mind. I think the doctrine of heaven, if you are a theist, if you have a theological account where you accept that as the great rest, is a mistake, because it's not. That's the kind of the arguments from Aquinas and other people is the divine state is one of the beatific vision, of contemplation. It's like the most active state. It's actually the complete opposite. So I think that's a great example of kind of drawing out our relationship to time It's just ass backwards. But lack is demonstrating that. That's what's useful about this. So for all its dangers and all its crazy, like we can get all this blown out, we can get blown out in a lot of different directions from this. I think it's the approaching of time and a discussion about it. I think that is really interesting. I'll close with that.
Okay. I feel like I'm just gonna be mirroring what I've heard for a little bit. But I wanted to, Thomas, I think those are some really great points. But I'm gonna rewind a little bit, and I want to go back to contentless hope for a moment. I actually just wrote a piece called "Safety's False Hope," and it was like just about that. Like when you cast your hope into images, it's like that same sort of process of like turning a lack of light into a shadow figure, and and it's not really hope. Like I agree very much with Javier that like really hoping needs to be oriented beyond what is known, and I don't think that's impossible. Like I actually think that's like the point of disciplines, like spiritual disciplines, like as are discussed in the cloud of unknowing. Like there's a way to try and drop all of the idols that you so easily put in the place of a future that is unknowable. And I think what I brought up in that piece is that whenever we hope for something, we can't like separate it from the rest of the world, because there's an inherent interconnection to the arising of anything, right? Like if I hope for a car, like I can't do that I mean, that's a weird example, but like a car is created by things, it's purchased by me with money and a job. Like, I mean, there's this whole like network of reciprocity in which I can have the thing which I hope for. And so anything really that you're going to be hoping for, it's going to be connected to the oneness of like everything. And I think that sort of maybe can introduce an element to this discussion, which is that is like part and whole dynamics, where when you're lacking something, it might be that there is a part to the whole which is perceivably missing or lacking. And so it's not really just like something which isn't there, it's something which the whole sort of like like suggests, which is, like a person, like if I were missing an arm, it's because there's a body plan to a human organism. And this made me think of one of my favorite Rilke poems. It's super short. It's called Losing. And he says, losing to, well, this is an English translation. Losing to is still ours, and even forgetting still has a shape in the kingdom of transformation. When something's let go of, it circles, and though we are rarely the center of the circle, it draws around us in its unbroken, marvelous curve. And I think like when you think of a curve, like that implies a whole circle. And so it's like it is a part of a circle, and it makes you miss the whole circle by drawing a curve. And I thought that sort of related, to what Lieber was saying. I think, or sorry, was it Matthew? Somebody said, or no, sorry, Son. I don't even know. That it's dance-like, right? Like you're kind of there's a motion that has grace, which you want to go into. And I think that also speaks to what Thomas is saying, like in time, like there are these sort of curves in time, and things proceed in ways that we anticipate, or which are harmonious. And when they don't, that curve, that like nice graceful trajectory becomes broken, and then we have a sense that it's missing. Lastly, maybe this is a weird place to take it, but last year I my grandma died, and the week that it happened, I was fasting, and so I had this week of fasting, and then I got this news that my grandma wasn't doing so great, and then I went and spent some time with her, and then she died. And then I remember putting this note in my phone, and it was just like, I fasted all week, and then grandma died, and then like, but I've never felt like I just went without a lot of things that I really like, and I just felt so grateful. I felt really grateful for food. I felt really grateful for my grandma. Like I was just like, after the end of it, like I was really like this weird happiness. And it made me think of like the motto for 15-minute cities. Like you like how within a 15-minute city you won't have it, there will be nothing to which you do not have access to. Like you will own nothing, but you will be happy kind of slogan. Like you'll own nothing, but you also lack nothing, which is very different. Like when you own something, you own it at the expense, like you trade a finite amount of money for one thing in lieu of all other things. And if you can just have everything, and that doesn't even matter, like you're not going to lack anything. You know, how do you have that same like gratitude where it's like, oh, like I spent all my money or whatever, like on this one thing because I value this one thing. And like there's there's an investment there that is that like befriends lack.
This actually reminds me of a Rumi poem. I forgot how it goes. It goes something like this about Rumi says you don't desire the bread, you desire the desiring of the bread. That's how he like framed it, which I thought was great because that really frames it. We don't think about us desiring the desire. And I think, and that's way, yeah, it's gone. We're desiring the desire, and ironically enough, I think in certain elements of gratitude, I think there's a acknowledgement of that, even though it hasn't been fully expressed, I would say. But the reason why I say that is because there's something that I think when we talk about gratitude, there is something that is exceeding the reality, or what we perceive as the reality of the object, of the situation, right? You could say, oh yes, I have this, this is my grandmother's watch, and I keep it because it's my grandmother's watch. But materialistically, it's like every other watch. You know what I mean? So for me, it has to be the fact that, and this is where the content has to be infiltrated within the lack. And this is why desire is so easy to miss, is because when we say it's my grandmother's watch and that's why it's sentimental to me and that's why I love it, even though it's literally like every other watch, we can see clearly that the lack that is content. My grandmother is gone. She's no longer present, and yet she's absent and yet present precisely because it's her watch. And so in this movement, we don't realize that the appreciation of the item itself is precisely not the item, and yet the item, because we need a materiality to it. And it's there that we desire the desire of my grandmother's presence that is founded in the watch. And I think that's usually like a very I mean, I'm totally agreeing with you, Sam, by the way. I just think that's like a missed explication about gratitude. Because I think the way a lot of pop culture talks about gratitude is a kind of gratitude that, I don't know, I want to say like I'm very tempted to say this. I don't think it's accurate, but kind of like just surface level appreciation of lack. And I think that's the danger that I find sometimes with gratitude versus a real visceral disruption of gratitude, which I think is what I would be talking like. I think that's what you're getting at, say, like a visceral disruption that is gratitude as such, not this um, kind of preliminary practice of gratitude. But I think a preliminary practice of gratitude can get to a kind of very disruptive gratitude where you literally feel the visceral notions of lack and what it means to lack. And so in that sense, I would say that's the kind of gratitude that I could say would be like a negative pragmatism. And it would relate to Dawkins' notion of time. Of course, I haven't really explained how. I think we'll probably fill some of the gaps there. But I think in relation to time, I think is the word longing. It's longing. Longing is in relation to love and time, in my opinion. But yeah, I see that Matthew wants to talk. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I didn't come in with a ton of expectations for what we'd be talking about, but I did have one thought that I did want to share. And I think you'll be interested in this, Javier, but I think the problem that when we think about wastefulness or uselessness, the problem that I think we run into in our culture is there's this revolutionary possibility in wastefulness where you kind of step out of the utilitarian, you produce something that is not necessary, something excessive. But the two sort of problems that you want to avoid is simultaneously like, does that artifact that gets produced, does it get taken back up into the system? Like, did you just produce it for the system to ultimately just take it up and use it for itself? But also like avoiding the problem too of like, oh, I'm being useless in order to produce something that will be useful for me somehow in a way I don't even know. Like avoiding the, oh, I spend time doing something useless because I think that it's good for me, like, oh, I need to rest my mind, so therefore I do something useless. That somehow uselessness is still a part of optimizing. Like, how do we get to a uselessness that is not even a part of like an optimizing framework, where it's not optimizing for me and it's not optimizing for the system? Because I do think that the production of genuine wastefulness does in the long run produce some of the greatest value that humanity has ever experienced. I mean, it's from Isaac Newton sitting under the apple tree, that we get the theory of gravity. But at the same time, how do we avoid those two kind of problems that I kind of outlined there? I'm curious what other people think about that.
I mean, Matt, that's a great segue, Matt, because actually, here, I'll give you a concrete example. Was so many times in my life, people in my life, parents, relationships, girlfriends, they were like, "What are you doing?" Like, they were saying my pursuit of design and art and philosophy. They were like, "What is this? What are you going to do with it? Go get a real job." Like, that language was used constantly. And I remember, I mean, this is like, I'm actually thinking through that. Matthew, your point reminded me of that. I remember I was so dogged. I was like, son of a bitch. Like, I was like, no, right now you're right. Right now, yes, it is useless. Yes, you are correct. You are rational in the assessment. This is not optimal use of my time. You are correct. But I actually remember, God bless myself. I do. I'm very proud of myself, even at a young age. Like, and I remember this. Maybe if I can give you any different accounts of this. This was an issue of all my life growing up, where I was like, no, I believe in this. I'm going to commit. Can I even give you an answer back to say, no, you're wrong? No, you're not wrong at that moment. But I made a commitment saying, no, I will commit. I will move forward, even when it's useless now. And it's funny because then in retrospect, it was successful. It was useful. It was not possible in the time. It was actually impossible. Like, here, I'll give you a couple examples. One was, I remember, Yeah, I actually remember. Yeah, I basically just graduated. I was like, I graduated 2008, right? And there's no jobs basically in art, in design. There was not. And it's very vulnerable when you enter, when you're basically a recent grad in the arts, especially, and you go into an economic downturn. You're basically you just screwed yourself over big time. And my parents literally said, "Go get a real job." I was like, "No, I'm not going to waste my I'm going to commit. Like, even if I have to struggle for a couple years, committing long term will pay out." And it's funny because my parents, I don't like talking about this, but it's relevant in this one particular issue of what is the optimal use of my time. In that moment, it was absolutely useless. Like, it was a joke. It was ridiculous. I was poor. But when fast forward 5 years, 10 years, I'm getting checks that are basically the income of my parents over multiple years in one payout. All of a sudden, all the critiques went away because I could validate. Because I remember I had a moment with my mother specifically where I actually showed her the check, and I was like, "Do you have anything to say to me?" She said, "You're right." I was like, "Thank you." And this was a decade. This was a decade of withholding to finally have a vindication. But that's an example. Like, that is a relationship with devotion and love and time, where it looks completely in that one moment, like in the particular time moment, irrational, not useful, low utility, all that. Actually, in philosophy too. Like, I remember this. I had a girlfriend at the time who was like, "Why are you reading this Aristotle? What are you doing? Like, what is this?" I know so many professors who are like, who are like, "What are you reading Aristotle for? He's not contemporary." I mean, there's an issue about that, which is like the utility value of time. Actually, the Lindy effect demonstrates that you're actually better using your time to study something that's lasted for 2,000 years than something that has been around for 5 years, right? It actually doesn't make sense in that way. But I think I talked with Daniel about this. For all of us to actually have useful conversations, how much time did it take us? Like, I've been studying Aristotle and Aquinas and Plato for 10 years. That's insane. I thought about that. I was in my early 20s when I started. I was useless in the beginning. I'm sitting here going, "Oh, potential and actual." My brain couldn't even comprehend those concepts. And when I teach my students, yeah, they're babies. They're struggling at the basics. But it takes dedication. You look like an idiot. It's true of all disciplines. You look like an idiot. You're ugly. You're literally ugly. So I remember in the net session when I talked about the almost aesthetics of play and kind of almost that relationship to play, it takes a level of virtue, of fluency over time to actually be able to enter that domain, to actually be a contributive member in a discipline. All of us here required at least a couple years of training in philosophy, let alone our sub-disciplines, like whatever we're doing with our careers. Sam, I know for architecture, exactly the same point. It literally takes a long time for that to happen. So I'm just thinking through, like, I'm thinking that just this one story I'm telling you is an example playing out of this relationship. And it is based on a time context. I think another example, just to share on the screen, does anyone remember the Fearless Girl statue that was placed next to the Raging Bull in Times Square? Does anyone remember that? I'll throw it up. I remember talking about this in a debate, like way years and years ago. It was back when statues were being taken down from public spaces, and I was against doing that. And the reason why was because, let me make sure, can you see my screen while I'm here with you guys? Okay, good. So what's happened is, the Raging Bull is in Times Square. That statue's been there since 1989. I think in the mid 2000s, basically, it was an ad move, but I think it's useful. This bronze girl statue has been placed in front of it. And actually, the original artist of the Raging Bull wanted the girl statue removed, precisely because it changed the context of the sculpture of the bull. It completely transformed it. So that's kind of when we talk about this kind of temporal space shifting, it's really just another example of just spatial shifting, spatial context shift. You can intervene. You can basically put something in that completely transforms what was already there. This is a physical space example, but examples of kind of your ethical position in time is another example of that. At least what Javier was saying about kind of the relationship of the watch, the heirlooms. There's a dimensionality to that object. That's why it's a partial object. That's why I posted that link with that particle object discussion video with Daniel, because the original context was gratitude. That was the reason why we got into the topic. Gratitude is an intellect. It's really fascinating because in Aquinas and Aristotle, there's a really interesting question: where does gratitude sit? Specifically in Aquinas, I'll focus on that. There's moments where he talks about it as a debt of love, and there's other moments of a debt of knowledge. Like it sits in a really he fluctuates on where he wants gratitude to sit. Because when you don't show gratitude to something, you're doing an injustice. So, for example, if your parents who raised you, if you don't show gratitude to them, you're not giving them the justice due to them, for example. But similarly, when we don't show gratitude to God, for example, we're not sure that's a relationship of removing our love, right? That's another example, let alone justice. But that's the point. He fluctuates on this point. So that's originally how. So it relates to both a state of ignorance, or you purposely ignoring something. Excuse me. But at the same time, it's a lack of a willingness to be intimate with it, right? With the object in question or the topic in question. So gratitude has a really, you have to be a certain nature of character to show gratitude. And almost always, when you think of practical examples of gratitude, it requires an act of remembrance. It is not about the thing in front of you. It's about its relationship to a larger context or a larger time frame. This is always why, Daniel, I agree with Daniel. Time as a dimensionality is not a secondary thing of space. It at least is co-equal with it, minimum, if not prior to it, one or the other, because of that fact. So when we have that intimate relationship with the heirloom watch, or for me, I have my sweater from my father, for example, when he was my age. So when I wear it, I have as remembrance of my father. There's a temporal dimension of that sweater that just because only I have access to it, or people close to my father have access to that sweater, does not mean it doesn't have reality to that. That's just a different dimensionality that may be a little more personal, less particular, but it doesn't change the fact that it has that dimension, that it has a temporal nature to it. The last thing that Sam was talking about, right? Because I originally raised my hand because I just finished Ramadan. So absolutely, the idea of the significance of obstruction. It's almost like I remember especially the first day after fasting, like the Ramadan fasting's done, where I had my afternoon coffee. It was the most meaningful coffee because of it was almost like meaning requires this joy of obstruction. There is no meaning, because that's the point with the 15-minute city where we'll own nothing. We will make no sacrifices. We will make no choices. And therefore we're not, and that's why I wish Wilbur was here, because to choose is to cut off. You're making a bifurcation. This and not this. Everything else is not. It's only in that figure, so this is using a metaphor of figure ground. It's only in that bifurcation of choice that something meaningful shows up in the first place. If there is no bifurcation, there is no meaning, because there is no definition of separation. But that's the kind of the thing is but then the fun part is that choice of framing, kind of get back to the original point I brought at the beginning of the symposium, that's a choice. And that's not just a dimensional choice, it's a temporal choice. So I'll close with that.
Son?
I just wanted to I raised my hand to respond actually to Matthew's comment on usefulness and wastefulness. I just wanted to say that I think that there's a step further to take where it's usefulness kind of debases being, because I don't think you can have a notion of inequality without usefulness, if we think that what we are boils down to a function, then yeah, you can say that one is better than other along the lines of X, Y, or Z function. But if we, but if we all think of ourselves, if we really appreciate usefulness and not because it's going to lead to some valuable revelation, but just let our being be, and that's okay. It's I think it has implications. It allows for equality, and I think that's important.
Well, I think that raises the question of whether, like, is wastefulness a moment of the suspension of valuation? Like, is it possible to do that? Because, I mean, to me, like, the possibility of inequality just emerges from us as valuing creatures. You know, it's kind of the Nietzschean take. So, if wastefulness is leveling, like you were just kind of postulating, is wastefulness a moment of the suspension of values?
I think it needs to be. Yeah.
Well, then I
This
think
is
the question becomes something like, if value is so overdetermined in your society, how can you, what does he say? Like, what does he call it? The transvaluation of values, and see that it's like, I wonder if the ultimate gratitude is amor fati, and if that has kind of a different coloring for what he talks about in the gay science between what is it, like people who suffer from an overabundance of life and those that suffer from a scarcity of life. I like to imagine that there's like at least one person who got that just right. There's like one Goldilocks that's just like, I don't know what you guys are talking about with all this suffering. But I doubt, well, maybe, I don't know. Anyway, I think the idea, as far as, like, I really like the idea about the doctrine of negative pragmatism. And I wonder what you think about a sort of boots on the ground, day in, day out choice architecture surrounding that. Its sustainability. Might it require, I don't know, a few hours of grinding in the marketplace in order to reproduce one's being? How could it, like, run into issues with chat and AGI kind of dislocating our Protestant work ethic? Because, like, that's another thing I think people, like, it's easy to overlook sort of the idea of who gets credit for what. This is not such a simple thing. And it used to be like people would remain anonymous. And like the cathedral construction, for example, they would spend many generations building something they knew they weren't going to see the completion of. And do we have something like that as far as a way to symbolize our immortality whilst fighting for bread and housing? And how, if all of a sudden we move sort of from like a Marxist frame of exploitation of the worker to like a neglect of just being like, yeah, we got a machine to do the thing that you spent a lot of time studying to do, and like stay at home and I don't know what, like get a universal basic dividend for hitting buttons. I don't know, but I wonder what the negative, like how the negative pragmatics can be brought into choice to, I don't know if enhance story is the right word I'm looking for, but to relate with the unfolding of story.
I like this idea, son, because this idea of suspension of value is interesting to even incorporate. How do we incorporate that in a choice architecture? How do we incorporate that within our choices? One, I think the first step, and maybe we can disagree, and this is to everybody, instead of suspension of value, suspension of usefulness first. Suspending what we perceive as useful. Because I think if we suspend what's useful, we allow the very opening for being to see what else it could be. right? What else could it be besides the very thing that we dictate as useful? Because this is the hard conversation, that we talk about waste, we talk about uselessness. For people, they're like, all right, I feel like you're trying to get around a kind of valuative argument. But if we suspend something like what is useful, I think this is what I liked what Sam, you said here, that usefulness kind of debases being, you know, at least I think that's how you said it. And this idea of suspending our, what we perceive as useful, to be in contact with being in the moment, and what that looks like, I mean, it's hard to say. I think it would be something similar to imagining how my day would be going, how I can make most use of my day, right? All the things that I'm supposed to make use of my day, planning out my day, and so on. And this idea of not of refraining. I've actually, I want to think about waiting, this idea of waiting, not as a physical waiting as such, but a waiting as a mode of being, right? And what would it mean to wait as a mode of being? Well, it's like, I don't know. I think that's the negative pragmatic part, right? It's like, it's just like, you're just constantly like, I don't know, but I want to see what could be out of this suspension. And I think, ironically, I've been thinking about Leibniz a lot recently, and this idea of the perfect world is the best possible world is whatever. I forgot how the phrasing is. But I think the shadow world, the world that suspends being, is the best possible world. That suspends whatever we perceive. And like, this is what goes back to Jawkins' point. What is substance? We don't really have a clear answer what that is. But I think that's a key feature, though. If we suspend being, if we suspend our notion of substance, we ironically create the best possible world, precisely because it can remain and persist as a shadow world as such. It's when we get trapped in the shadow world as reality as such, and not realizing that it is a shadow world, that we strip away the possibility of it being the best possible world. But I don't know. Those are just thoughts that I've been having, and so on. But I see that it's Jawkins' turn.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because actually I think one of the more modern positions is the idea of suspension of disbelief. I think that's very fascinating, in the sense of, when we think we let narrative. I wish Luber was here, because I know it comes from a idea of narrative and performance, right? That a story, we as an audience allow a suspension of disbelief so that a story can act on us, right? Have the effect. What we're asking here is suspension of judgment, right? So actually also ideas of there's a very modern mode, I would argue, like kind of idea of suspensions, like withholdings of tolerance or disbelief or belief, really. I do think this is interesting, this idea we're talking through of, I'm actually on the more of the position, I don't think we need to suspend the judgments. I actually, in terms of value, I'm of the position it's more an act of, that's a transparent choice. Like it's moving an image from a transparency to something opaque that we become aware of. Like that's more a position I would stand on. What I mean by that is we must have values. There is no way to not have value. But that act of value is a choice. And you want to value the social normative standards of X? Yeah, you can do that. You can also choose something else. So this is the kind of, that's a Nietzschean mode too. It's a transformation of the value system by claiming that you're not a slave to it. You'll make another one instead. And in fact, even social hierarchies are based on that. I mean, a lot of social hierarchies are really, the basic point is if you can't succeed in the one that you're in, make a new one and organize around that. But that's generally like kind of like a practical point. of how to address that. But I agree with the general point though of this is actually really important. Like I just posted in the chat from Aristotle, I reminded instantly of that from Udinian ethics. Usefulness is a very flattening of reality. It flattens things. It's a flattening of dimensionality of existence down into a flatter plane that's comprehensible, right? It gives you a nice story to work by, nice image. But the totality of existence, and that's the point. Like even Aristotle talks about this, right? There's basically friendships with pleasure. So that's if you're using that as your orientation, you're almost like you're a tractor of orientation of how you organize your life. It's based on pleasure. You'll get one outcome of life, right? One nature of relationships with reality and people and things. So it's then the usefulness. That's another relationship. It's a little more more permanent, a little more withstanding, but not necessarily that solid. Because usefulness changes. That's the point. But then the argument of friendship with virtue, that is the one that holds permanence, because virtue doesn't exhaust itself. That's the argumentation built up from that. But I think that's what comes down to is like there's value absolutely in play in there. It's just a choice of which one. They're all correct in the sense that they obtain, right? You can orient your life around pleasure, and a lot of people do. A lot of people orient their lives around usefulness, utility of different modes. Again, this is it's correct. It obtains to reality. You can map it on, but these are virtual mappings. So this is another example of a discussion of the gradation of lack. There's another kind of demonstration of that, or way we can talk about it. So this discussion here of kind of a weighting, right? I think that comes down to a question of a time frame reference. Because that's the thing too. Also, it's interesting because wisdom does have a temporal. Like, let me put it this way: if you only look at things in a very narrow time span, you should get high all the time. You should be constantly high. You should basically you should be in a state of constant pleasure seeking. If you're oriented by pleasure tends to have usually a time-based orientation. That's very narrow, right? So I was the person's an addict, just a meth addict, just constantly high all the time. Why not? But with use utility, almost always requires a longer time span. But then also even that has a limit though. But then virtue has a point. Virtue has the longest time span. So you can almost make that build of argument that we're actually using time here as a way to define the change of these gradations too. I'm not sold on that, but I'm just working through the thought of this. So again, it's a way to articulate this relationship with time. It gets difficult because Aristotle says, one argument of happiness, the happy man, even when he's dead, can we even finally conclude he had a fulfilling life, a full life? Because if you make the argument, it's not good enough that his life died, his life completed to an end. Well, if his children didn't succeed, or his city, especially if it was like a founder of a city, for example, then for example, Marcus Aurelius, everyone claims this is a great man, right? Wrote these great books, but then his son was a complete tyrant. It's a complete disaster. Aristotle's asking, obviously Aristotle didn't live at that time, but that kind of question applies. Like, does that affect Marcus Aurelius and his assessment of was his life totally in the full standing of things? That's where it gets a little difficult, because that's where we don't have a limiting principle to justify where does the duration of time measurement change. Maybe the only conclusion then is thus God, because that's the point. God is outside time, so thus he is the only one. That's the only measure and reference that can hold to this standard. But if you don't have a theistic account, then you can't do that. So I don't know what you do. That's what I got.
I think that was a good point, Thomas, but I did want to propose a distinction, because I feel like I agreed with both you and Matthew, where I also I don't want to suspend values, because but at the same time I think actually what is being said is more a suspension of evaluation rather than the values are there, but it's just we can take a pause from the measurement and the assessment of something against the values, because you don't want to let go of things that you're living by. And then afterwards you took it into time, and I wanted to bring up that point, so I'm glad you brought it up again, because I think when Javier, you talked about waiting, I just had this thought about just like about the phenomenology of waiting. It's like what happens when we sit down and we wait for something. It is a change in our relationship to time, because I think you get the principle of duration taking hold of you when you're waiting sort of surrenders, and there is some way of partitioning time in such that like when you enter into that intention or something, like you sit down, you stop your functioning or whatever, you start waiting, and then it feels pretty homogenous, but it changes the quality of time constantly, the duration of it. It is effective, and so like I think that's a big part of what we're talking about, and the utility of some sort of suspension is that time itself sort of, it seems to, I don't really know what is going on there, but when you do engage in that sort of suspension, like anybody who meditates knows that like it takes time. You know, you have to like change yourself through waiting, like into a different mode.
Yeah, I'm glad we're circling around this word. Matthew actually helped me on my paper for Cadell's what is that book called? Science of Logic. Where I just played with WEIGHT as well as wait, as well as await. And like the Germans have a great way of talking about ideas where they call it an idea falls in. That's how they, so they talk about like, I guess a way of languaging a digital detox would be holiday from the barrage of exogenous images. And then just to kind of be like, okay, still something from the outside comes. And this is sort of a different way of tapping into being that may follow the Lacan psychotic discourse, where there is a foreclosure of the name of the Father, and you open yourself to this almost like alien invasion of ideas whereby interiority is temporarily suspended, and you're just like, oh, there's nothing there. It all comes from the outside, and just kind of seeing if you can retie the Baromean using that that angle, and how what we are up against on some level is, I think it's Zach Stein calls it like a crisis of attention. So there's a certain amount of attention without which getting to that place is just, and I guess you could do it with drugs or something like that, but otherwise it's like it would have to happen like pretty accidentally, like a Damascene moment or something like this, versus going on the exploration of deep work, long daydreams and stuff like this.
Just real quick, I really like what we're circling on here with waiting and so on. And it's funny because when I work at an urgent care, I can tell the waiting that is being practiced is usually an impatience. I'm waiting. I'm waiting. I'm waiting. I'm tired of waiting. No, I'm waiting. It's a really ironic kind of position when people the way people think about waiting, because I think most people's conception of waiting is actually fundamentally rooted in a kind of impatience. Oh, I have to wait. Oh, great, we have to wait. Right? Like I can't get to the thing that I desire. I can't get to it. But this other waiting, this other notion of waiting, which doesn't have, and I agree with you, Sam, that I think that's what's hard to talk about, the waiting that is both physical but not patient, and yet really being there. I could say the waiting that is impatient is not being there. And in that sense, when you're not being there, you are cut off. And so I think there is a sense in which negative pragmatism would be, I don't even know if it would be an avoidance of being cut off, but it would be perhaps the lack of guarantee that you could be cut off or could be remain in. You could remain, you could fall in. Because I think I really take sympathies with Matthew's argument here, is that it gets really dangerous when we start talking about these sort of pragmatic notions of lack. Because what I see is optimization. I can see people going, how do I optimize my day with lack? And that's minimalism. That's minimalism. But I mean,
It's like lack hacks.
yes, lack hacks. Like, I don't want it to
Yeah.
become a fucking like, I don't want it to be a fucking heuristic about your way of living. But I do agree with you, son, about the barrage of images. But I think it has to be connected to I want to say the body. It has to be connected to the body, I think, because I don't want people, because this your idea can easily turn into an optimization. It's all right, guys. We're gonna go pretend image monks, and we're just gonna whatever. But I think here's the thing: the problem that I have with optimization, and perhaps this is the very subtle distinction, is that optimization promises something. And I want to say negative pragmatism is not interested in that promise. It's interested in the fact that it's a lack of guarantee, but you must still you must still persist anyways. That's the problem I have with optimization. Optimization promises that if you fail, you can succeed. If you try, you can overcome. No. That's a way to deal with lack in such a negative way. That's a way to get rid of lack by extending time. If you extend time, you can get rid of lack. That's my fear with optimization, efficiency, everything, is that we extend time to get rid of lack. But what if it didn't get rid of it? That's the problem that I have, because people don't know how to deal with that. Because in order for me to give you how to deal with that, I have to promise you another optimization. And I'm not interested in giving you another optimization. I am interested in how you abide in that failure. So, for example, Jochen, with your story, as much as I do like it, but I do imagine that you would still pertain to a sort of value in what you were doing, whether you succeeded or not, whether you had the proof of money or not, I would feel. But it would really challenge you viscerally if you could never prove it to your mother that this was worth doing. If that makes any sense.
You mind me jumping in just to answer that point?
Yeah, you can jump in. You can jump in.
Yeah, just because I was about to say is like, I appreciate what Sam is saying about, because this is actually an issue of measurement. Like I think that's a fair distinction. Just on your point, like actually that's the whole point, was that I wasn't doing it for the money. Like while there's a certain satisfaction, I only use that to just demonstrate that in the particular moment where that was the evaluation of assessment, that was that action right or not to do, the critique was no, it's not. And I had no recourse to challenge it because I didn't. But it wasn't the reason why I was doing it, but just the point. Like that's an example of dimensionality flattening. So if that action was only be evaluated on its money-making capacity at that time, yeah, that would be true. And I had no way to recourse to it. And while we have this nice narrative satisfaction of getting to use the duration of time, but that was the whole point. Like I did not sustain the awaiting for the sake of making money. That wasn't the purpose of it at all. I would never have endured if that was the reason. But that's an issue of measurement, which I think what Sam was saying is very fair. I think it's an issue of, that's the danger. The danger is when things get measured. Actually, I was just talking about it with a colleague of mine. In typography, when design of typography got much more mathematic, measured in a very explicit rationalist way, we saw a push for a polarization and like all these different properties of type. It's like in the act of measurement, there's almost a psychotic neuroticism kicked in immediately. I think Daniel made this comment before too. Is like people go psychotic when they get rational, like when they get hyper rational and they don't basically contain that rationality in I want to say a non-rational entity of some other safety structure, and this rely on the rational. They go insane because there's something about it that's incomplete that causes a kind of extreme, almost nuclear runaway effect into it. But I just want to jump in just to close this answer your point, Javier.
I think I'm gonna have to wrap up and jump, everybody. Great conversation, great chat with you all. Hope we can keep the conversation going. Bye, everyone.
Bye, Matt.
I think that brings up like a very interesting question of how do you measure lack as such, and is that does that have to be like a singular activity? Do you have to measure it?
I think like the inability to it is sort of like when I think of that, I'm like, okay, in order to measure lack, you need to know the whole, to which part is only a part. And who knows whole? Nobody knows whole. Only God knows whole. So there's like this inability to measure lack, but in that inability, it's like potential becomes boundless, and that might be the utility of the unknown, right? Like if we could measure lack, you could look at little Jimmy in the classroom and he's misbehaving and you think, oh, he's never going to amount to anything. Like, see, look, his lack is only so big. I guess, like, like really, like the fact that what he lacks, like what he is not yet, could be anything is like amazing. And we should always, I hope, strive to look at others like their lack is infinite.
Yeah, because my first instinct is you would normally use something like asymmetries. So via the asymmetric, you basically know something by asymmetry. There's difference, right? So because obviously symmetrical relationships or entities or objects are the same, right? That kind of A is A versus AB relationships. But it is difficult because that does require some demarcation, because you got to know where's the edge of what we're talking about. Because even in statistics, like omega space, that's usually what they use to say like, oh, possible realities. But it's still like they put a little boundary to say, okay, imagine everything, even if it goes on forever. And in fact, that's part of the reason why historically we usually don't reason with lack. Like we can't reason with it as an object of syllogisms because it has no boundedness. It's only in these like weird interfaces of other things interacting with it that does, in all the examples we've been using, it does tend to require some choice of frame to demarcate that allows you to create an asymmetrical relationship, like to see the asymmetries and thus be able to reason with it. But I think you're making a fair point, though, and that's what we're getting at here is like operation of measurement. I don't have an answer yet about that. I don't know, because I feel like obviously, unfortunately, we use measure as a way to understand.
It's funny. I mean, it's funny because I've been reading Foucault's things, and like my reading of like the way he like frames this first part is the fact of resemblance. He's saying that the 16th century epistemology was rooted on resemblance and likeness and like these various forms of similitudes. But what's ironic about this, and this is probably like my favorite line if I can find it. Let's see. It's right here. He goes, "It's not that words are imperfect or that when confronted by the visible, they prove insuperably inadequate. Neither can be reduced to the other's terms. It is in vain that we say what we see. What we see never resides in what we say. And it is in vain that we attempt to show by the use of images, metaphors, or similes what we are saying. The space where they achieve their splendor is not that deployed by our eyes, but that defined by the sequential elements of syntax." I really liked this framing because he's talking about that there's a fundamental mediation of lack between what we're saying, we're seeing in the midst of our saying. You know, and it's almost irreducible, and it's almost infinite as such to even try to get at. And this is where you talked about asymmetry, Jockin. The fact that we can misunderstand each other, in my opinion, is very proof. The very fact that we can be deceived is also very proof, right? But it's this overt fear of deception that we have. And I think you could say rationality has developed over an overt fear of deception, and it becomes psychotic, right? I don't want to be deceived, so we have to construct the most rational discourse. Of course, what is the most rational discourse ironically functions, I would say, with what Foucault is arguing. I haven't finished the book, but I get the sense that he's saying that lack is the fact that we can order things is precisely because of lack. The fact that we can perceive an order of things as such, an semblance as such, is precisely because of lack.
That builds on the typography example, right?
Yeah.
The idea that you need negative spaces between the letters and inside the letters so you can even comprehend it. If you didn't have that, it would just be a huge mass of black.
Yep. Exactly.
Well, by the way, I could build this point.
Measurement.
Oh, go on. Sorry, Javier. Go. Sorry.
Yeah. But that measurement, that question of the measurement of black is precisely because lack itself is the measure. Not like, you know what I'm saying? Like people try to grasp it the other way. We are trying to measure our lack and respond to it. Optimization. How do we overcome the distance from what I am lacking to reach a point to where I'm no longer lacking? That's how I would say is I'm measuring lack as such. But I think what people miss in that measurement of trying to approach optimization, it's a vague measurement. It usually comes up with normatives, ways of practicing, and so on. But it's the fact that the lack itself is a measure. But the thing is, because the lack is lacking, like Sam said, there is no whole. Who has the whole? The lack is the whole, and yet the whole itself is the HOLE. And so we are using a HOLE as the measure for everything else, which we think is a sort of very concrete whole, as if we had known what it was. I said a lot of obscure terms there, so
No. To build on what you're saying, Javier, it's funny because measurement depends on a unit, and the tradition, and it's been while today we think the unit is a number, it's not a number. Not in Aristotle. I was about to pull up the text about it. Because the unit is the thing in which we use to measure in the first place. And a unit tends to be an indivisible thing. Now I need to pull the text because I want to draw through that, because indivisibility kind of implies that you do not know the demarcation of it. Or it's kind of like it gives an implication of it. It's another direction about it. Because a point is, you know what I'm saying is, because a point is infinite, technically. Like, in one sense, we see a point is definite, but in another sense, it's not, because of basically, like, for example, that point has a kind of indefiniteness also at the same time. So it has a kind of double effect because of that. I need to pull the text from Aristotle to remember the particulars on that. But I'm just saying what I'm bringing up here is that we that's an older opinion. Generally, we assume that the unit is a number or it goes right to number immediately, but it's not. It's actually a categorical difference, and it's true because, for example, the units we use, mass, weight, volume, whatever. I mean, they do have qualitative differences. What you use as a unit, but I don't know how to interpret that with lack. That's kind of the question point about it. But that's something came to my mind just thinking what you were saying, Javier.
Well, it makes me think a little bit of how we use language as a measure, and I'm wondering if there's like a calling for a new language, if that's one of these always already things, or if there is like maybe a delineation to be made between the binary of the useful, which may finally be able to be satisfied by zeros and ones, versus the sort of multivariate radiance of human language, and that a language of lack is too threatening at the moment. I don't know if threatening, too, I don't know, just not thought of enough, or I'm not finding it, but something like this.
I think it's threatening because we think, or I think people are tempted to think it's pessimistic. You fall into a pessimism or you fall into a nihilism. I think that's what people are thinking. But I think the problem that we have with lack is I've actually talked to Jochen about this in an extent, is the way we think about nothing. People interact with lack, but for them it's something / nothing, right? It's either there's something or there's nothing. This is what's interesting about, even if we talk about the meaning crisis, it's either there's meaning or there's no meaning. They don't even entertain the perspective, perhaps, that the meaning is always, in some sense, in suspense, right? You are subjected to time. And so the meaning changes. But the thing is, the way the meaning changes for people is that they had a certain content to that meaning, and then it eradicates, like time disintegrates the meaning, right? And so they don't look at it as a progressive evolvement of that meaning. They look at it as a degradation, a loss of value as such. And it's this notion of nothing. But to me, the way people talk about nothing, and this is why I like Japanese philosophers a lot, because I think it was Nishida that got to this point. He goes, when we talk about something in relation to nothing, that's not the real nothing that I'm talking about. This is what Nishida says, right? It's not the real nothing. The real nothing that is being talked about is not in relation to something, which elucidates to me that the nothing that is in relation to something is actually the lack. That's the nothing that people are talking about. But you see, to me, this is the fucking biggest hurdle talking about lack with just normal people, or anybody that doesn't talk about lack on a kind of daily basis like we are, is that it's either something or nothing. We're still functioning off of this principle. It's either I'm a success or a failure. It's either it's useful or it's not. Again, I hear the same paradigm. It's either something or it's nothing. Either you are a useful man and I date you, or you're nothing. You're a bum. You're lazy, right? Like, you can see it in the culture. Value is either valued or not valued. And so it's either efficient or not efficient. It's either rational or irrational. And irrational tends to fall into precisely this uselessness, incoherence, and everything. But lack is that kind of third language, I would say, that is hard to speak. because it is fundamentally moving a kind of in a dialogue or dialectical fashion. Because you're trying to say that your notion of nothing is actually not nothing. It's just a notion. But when you experience loss as such and despair as such, it really does feel as if it is a complete obliteration of everything that you know or everything that you love. But what I want to say is it's precisely that force, that power, that enactment on the body that is lack. Because you cannot feel nothing. That is a very abstract idea itself, this idea that I feel nothing. Actually, I think a psychologist actually framed it very well. She goes, when my patients say that they feel nothing, it's actually the fact that it's indeterminate. There is so much going on that they cannot even pinpoint the feeling that is being felt. Right? It's an overload of your emotions that you feel nothing. Right? or you're stunned. You are legit caught in a being stunned of the moment, and you cannot determine what is happening. So it's very interesting to me that sometimes the dialogue that is perpetuated about efficiency, optimization is in essence to avoid nothing, but really it's nothing is abstract in itself, and so is something. Hegel talks about this too. But anyways, the whole point is lack. The dialectic itself is lack. And how do we get, this is the weird conversation where it's like, how do we get people to encounter this? But then the ironic position that I am in is that people do encounter this. This is where I think Luber's distinction is helpful, where it's like they're just unaware of it. And they have yet to catch on. So I wonder if it's being proactive in a negative way in terms of being more suboptimal, like Alex Ebert talks about. But yeah, forgot who's Sam.
I do need to go shortly, but I wanted to say that like, yeah, I think it's less of like, how do we make people see what we see or something? Because like, who's gonna live like that? Like, but I think it is like when I see, like, I might have a relation, like certainly I would have, if I had a child, I would have a relationship to a child, and one that would be, there would be a responsibility of teaching, right? And so like, it's your, it's not really your place to be like, how do we make these other people see these things? But you do have certain relationships where you are a guide. And also, you have relationships of love where maybe, I think sometimes like the people who love me can see me better than I can see myself. And in those moments, I would hope that they would have some way of communicating, like of helping me get to gratitude when I am despaired, like, and what that is, I think it's like, I think the best like vessel for those sorts of things are symbols and stories, like specifically stories, like because you're saying about how lack is the thing that grips you, and like I think like you tell a story about it's set in Verona, there's this guy and this girl, and there's a balcony, there's all these details, there's a party, a sword fight, whatever, but like there's something about that was able to communicate something much greater than just like a place and time in Verona, right? Like yeah, and like I mean it really begs the question, like, what even am a story? Like, who are they? What are they doing? Do they live inside us? I don't know. Like yeah.
Build on what Sam's saying. I mean, obviously, Javier, I'm sympathetic to the idea that of wanting to be understood. I know that's a very natural instinct, right? I understand. I'm very empathetic to it. But really, from a pure ethics point of view, the best we got is exemplar ethics, meaning like live your life. Like, let's actually see what this psychotechnology, which I think that, okay, how many pages do I have notes? I have like 5 pages again of notes. I think we can probably fairly say this is a psychotechnology we're operating on to try to get to something, to get a different relationship to lack, right? Than as Luber said, the kind of self-forgetting, we're just driven by it, self-possessed. Basically, we're getting possessed by these lacks. We're not even aware it's happening. We're trying to basically hack our brains, like the hack our understanding, to come to that to get to a different relationship, which is a relationship. And then everyone agrees. I don't know if we all come to the same consensus, which is a relationship to time, right? Hence, that probably is one of the ways this would probably be signified. Time with ourselves, time with it, and at times with other objects and people, right? I think what Sam said too about, right, the difference between just a bunch of events happening one after the other and a theme. I think of the language, instantly my mind, what's the moral of the story, right? Now, there's one way that gets read as like a content loaded, like this is what you're supposed to take away from it. I think that's not that exciting and that interesting. But what's more interesting, what that's implying, is that there's something extra, excessive to just a bunch of sequence of events, which is theme, right? There's some larger thematic narrative that there are other stories that are analogously similar, have a similitude, right? And that by the repetition of these patterns, almost becomes a paradigm, right? Of how to when one orients their lives in this way, this is the consequence of it. That'd be a more useful way to talk about it or think about it. So, and that's why my point of exemplar ethics. Because, for example, in education, one of the most powerful ways we teach students is to start asking questions like, what would you do if you were X? So like in boxing, for example, box like Ali, box like Tyson, there's characteristics in character that if I had to sit here and give you the mechanic execution of what they did, that would be very laborious, and actually you wouldn't get it. But anyone who's fluent in boxing and and I say fluent, and not just in a fluency action way, but like you're literate, basically. Like you're literate to that story, that kind of domain. You can basically grab at it and then work with it, right? I just think I'm kind of sitting here thinking about that. Like these are kind of the takeaways I would take to it. And by the way, like I posted up on the chat about that idea of a unit. Like that's actually kind of like, I think that's exactly what we're getting at. And also I thought about, remember, 0 didn't exist as a number. Originally, it was actually a present absence. Its entire purpose was just to be a demarcator of position, of just like, this is an absence. Let the numbers flow through, basically, instead. It didn't have the significance we have now at our origin point. Because remember, Cartesian grid systems are based on the 0 point. That's where orientation is. The origin point is the 0 point. It's fascinating. It's almost like that's the that absence, the present absence, is the origin point of how we reference other things. So I'm just kind of building what you're saying, Javier, way to talk about it. But really, the good question is like, what do we do with this lack? Is how do we orient our lives around it? And that's going to be proof by what we do with this. Which is, by the way, like any good philosophy should do that. Like all those huge ontological and epistemology points, it's got to come down to an ethics point. And for people like myself and Sam, in the visual arts and the applied arts, like how do we make beautiful things with it? We are not succeeding if we don't make beautiful things. And from my work in literature and research, that beauty question is not just a visual representation thing, it's beautiful souls. So how do we make our souls beautiful in the first place? Maybe I'll close with that point, like just in closing, like, because I think the question of like the beautiful is a present absence, right? We don't even know. That's kind of the project of Plato. When he actually talks about the beautiful, he's pointing out we actually don't know what it is. We don't even know the totality of what the beautiful is. We have no clue. We only get images of it. We get little glimpses. But yet, nevertheless, we are aware of it. We know it exists. And what happens when we orient our lives around that? It becomes basically an orientation point for how we organize our lives. Because that's a very different I think that is very useful from just a pure ethics point of view. One would think that just seems like a completely arbitrary, very arcane approach, like kind of like not relevant to particular ethical problems. But I think it is. You ask a question when you have interactions with people, yourself, and everything, and on the circumstances of life. Is it beautiful? That's a very different standard than is it good, or is it useful, or did you get maximum utility for it? It's a very different question. And I thought it's bring it up because actually I think architecture and art is a very good example, or like applied arts is a good example, because if the question is let's optimize the space so houses are just instruments of living, right? Or going to work and back, like that's its operation is supposed to be a function just to get people to go to work and come back. Is it maximally optimized with utility? That's a very different relationship than asking if it's beautiful. Very different. I'll close with that.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll just because we can finish stop the recording. If there's just anybody else that has a kind of final say, reflection.
Yeah, I just want to say that that too flirts with the danger of optimization, and then how to like kind of know in your heart of hearts and in your practice, you know, the person who's optimizing for the beautiful versus I don't even know. I don't even know how to, on some level, avoid it. But
Exactly you cannot measure it. Like that's kind of exactly the point. Is that no, you're defeated in your attempt to try to measure. If you're acting measuring it, you got defeated. That's the point.
Well, and so I wonder then if it becomes something like what you were talking about in your nascent stages of reading philosophy, where you didn't understand these words, you didn't understand these concepts, and after the repetition, then you're like, oh, now I have a different grasp, a different grip on these writings. If there's an analog to lack literacy that can come down to kind of the particular, so that you are like, okay, I recognize these things about, you know, this part of the whole that when, I don't know what else to say besides triggered, I tend to stray from the path of the beautiful, and how to remain with that as sort of the guiding ideal, I think is an interest. Like that might just be a life.
I think the question that we're left with is because this is the dangers of optimization and efficiency and everything, and because it incorporates lack. That's what's hard about it. But you could say we can reflect on these two questions, and this will be for another symposium. Are we letting lack orient us, or are we orienting around lack? Because I think letting lack orient us is allowing precisely what Jochen is talking about. But the optimization question is the inverse, meaning it's how I orient myself around lack. And I think that's when we start getting into measurement of efficiency, optimization, and all these other all these other notions. So letting lack orient us and remaining with these questions, because it perhaps might not be immediately apparent to us in the moment whether we are letting the lack orient us or we are orienting around the lack. And this probably has to do something with awareness and unawareness and so on. But yeah, I'm happy to stop there. Again, I'll leave it open for one last point.
I think it's a good stopping point. And I actually have questions right there of like almost attempts of optimization to try to suffocate and destroy the gap. Because that's kind of the thing. There's a presumption just because you're aware of a gap, do you necessarily have to act on it? That's kind of an interesting point. Almost optimization, it takes the next step to say, notice there's a gap, and then feel like we have to obliterate it. But yet, ironically, as we talk through, it's actually the absences that actually give things life and actually give us articulation of difference in the first place. So that I think is a good stopping point, just to kind of, I'm going to think about that after this call. It's been a great time.
All right. We'll pause the recording.